My neighbor Paul retired at 53, and if you saw him on a normal day, you wouldn't think twice about him because he doesn't look like someone who has figured money out. He drives an old car that makes a slight rattling noise when it starts. There's dog hair stuck in the back seat that never really goes away. His clothes are simple. His watch probably costs less than a dinner, and nothing about him signals wealth. But one evening I asked him a question that people usually avoid asking directly. I asked him how much he had saved before he decided he didn't need to work anymore, and when he told me the number, I didn't even react at first because I didn't understand what I was hearing. But then he said something that completely shifted how I think about money. He said, "Tom, every important financial decision I ever made came down to $10,000. And I remember thinking that it sounded too simple, almost like he was reducing a complicated life into a neat little sentence. But then he started explaining it step by step, and within a few minutes I realized that this wasn't a motivational line. It was a system, and what made it powerful was that it kept showing up at every stage of life. Whether you were just starting out or already earning well, this number 10,000 wasn't about being rich. It was about crossing a threshold. And once you understand thresholds, you stop thinking about money emotionally and start thinking about it structurally. My name is Tom, and I didn't become financially stable because I was smarter than everyone else. I got there because I finally stopped ignoring simple rules like this and started paying attention to people who had already done it. So if you're tired of complicated advice that sounds good but doesn't work in real life, this is something you can actually use. And it starts with the first place. This number changes everything, which is your foundation. You've heard the advice before. Build an emergency fund, save 3 to 6 months of expenses, and be responsible. But the problem is that advice doesn't give you a starting point. It gives you a finish line without telling you how to begin. Because the moment most people hear 3 to 6 months, their brain immediately calculates a number that feels too big and too far away, and then they quietly give up before they even start. Paul told me to ignore all of that and focus on one simple goal: get to $10,000 in cash. Not invested, not locked away, not doing anything exciting, just sitting there available. And at first that sounded too basic, but then he explained something that made it click. Below 10,000 in liquid cash, you are not just broke, you are fragile, and when you are financially fragile, every small problem becomes expensive in ways you don't notice immediately. Your car makes a small noise, and instead of fixing it early, you delay because you don't want to spend money, and that small issue turns into a major repair later. Your health starts bothering you, and you ignore it because the visit feels unnecessary right now, and later it becomes urgent and costly. You buy cheaper things not because they are better, but because they are all you can afford in the moment, and over time those cheap decisions cost more than buying quality ones. This is what Paul described as the invisible tax of being broke. It's not one big expense, it's a pattern of small losses that add up over time. $10,000 doesn't make you rich, but it removes pressure, and that changes everything, because it's the point where you stop reacting and start deciding. When you have that buffer, you don't panic when something goes wrong, you don't rush decisions, you don't rely on credit to survive. Every dollar below that number increases stress in ways you don't fully see, and every dollar above it starts reducing that stress. It's not a smooth line, it's a shift in how you operate. I didn't understand this until I experienced it myself, because there was a time when I had a few thousand saved and I thought I was doing okay, but in reality I was constantly rebuilding because every unexpected expense wiped out progress and kept me stuck in the same place. Then slowly I crossed 10,000, and what changed wasn't my lifestyle, it was my behavior. I started fixing problems early instead of delaying them. I started making decisions with a clear head instead of reacting under pressure. And that's when I realized money is not just about what you can buy, it's about how you behave when things go wrong. But then Paul gave me the second part of this rule, and it made me uncomfortable because I was doing the exact opposite at the time. He said, "Tom, if your savings are below 10,000 you have no business owning expensive things, and that sounds obvious when you hear it, but most people violate this every single day, including me. I had things that looked good from the outside, but my foundation was weak and completely dependent on everything going perfectly. Paul didn't judge me, he just asked me a simple question: if your income stopped today, how long would your current life last? And I didn't like the answer because it forced me to see the gap between what I owned and what I actually controlled. Most people build their lifestyle first and stability later, and that order creates pressure that builds quietly over time. Paul explained it in a way that stuck with me. He said, problems are guaranteed in life. The only thing you control is how expensive those problems become, and that cost is directly connected to your buffer. $10,000 is not a wealth goal, it is a stability line. It separates people who can absorb shocks from people who get knocked down by them. And once you start looking at your life through that lens, you begin to notice something else. Every major financial decision has a hidden cost that most people ignore. They look at whether they can afford the monthly payment, but they don't look at how that decision affects their flexibility or their ability to handle unexpected situations. 10,000 becomes the filter, because if a decision reduces your ability to maintain that buffer, then it's probably not a smart decision, even if it feels affordable in the moment. I started seeing this pattern in my own life. Every bad financial decision I made happened when I was operating below that threshold, and every good decision happened when I had enough margin to think clearly. And then Paul said something that tied it all together. He said, money is stored time, and when you don't have a buffer, you are constantly borrowing time from your future self. You take on commitments that your future self has to deal with. You delay problems that your future self has to fix. You make choices that your future self has to pay for. 10,000 is the point where you stop borrowing and start owning your time again. And that idea stayed with me because it reframed everything. It made me realize that financial stability is not about chasing a huge number someday. It's about creating small points of control right now. Points where you are not forced into decisions and where you actually have options. Most people skip this step because it feels small compared to bigger goals, but that's exactly why it works, because it's achievable, and once you reach it, you don't just have more money. You have a different mindset. You stop thinking short term, you stop reacting, and you start building. And that's where everything begins to change, because $10,000 is not the finish line. It's the foundation, and without a foundation, nothing else you build will last. Once I understood that $10,000 was the foundation, I assumed that was the hard part. I thought once you crossed that line, everything else would just fall into place naturally. But Paul told me that most people don't fail because they never reach 10,000. They fail because they don't know what to do after they reach it. They treat it like a finish line instead of what it actually is, which is a starting point. And that's where the second layer of the 10,000 rule begins. Because once you have stability, the next step is protection. And protection comes from not making decisions that quietly destroy your ability to build wealth over time. Paul told me something that made me uncomfortable, because I was doing the exact opposite at that moment. He said, "Tom, never spend more than $10,000 on a car until your invested assets are at least $100,000. And I remember immediately thinking that this was too extreme, because in my mind a better car meant reliability, comfort and progress. But then he asked me a question that completely broke that logic. He said, if your car and your investments switched places right now, which version of you would be richer 10 years from now? And I didn't need to think about it, because the answer was obvious. But what made it powerful was the math behind it, because the difference between a $10,000 car and the $30,000 car is $20,000. And that $20,000 doesn't just sit there. It either disappears into a depreciating asset or it compounds over time, depending on your decision. If you invest that $20,000 into something that grows at an average rate over the long term, it doesn't stay $20,000, it becomes something much larger, because time multiplies it. While the car, regardless of how expensive it is moves in the opposite direction. It loses value every single year until eventually it reaches zero. Both cars end up in the same place, but the money you didn't spend doesn't, and that's where most people lose without realizing it, because they focus on what they're getting today instead of what they're giving up tomorrow. I saw this clearly in my own life because I was driving something that looked good on the outside, but financially it didn't make sense. My car payment was quietly eating a portion of my future every single month, and I justified it by telling myself it was normal because everyone around me was doing the same thing. But normal doesn't mean smart, and that was the mistake. Paul didn't tell me to stop enjoying life, he just showed me the trade-off in a way I couldn't ignore. He showed me that a decision that feels small in the moment can have a massive impact over time because of compounding, and once you see that you can't unsee it. I ended up selling my car and replacing it with something far cheaper, and at first it felt like I was stepping backwards, but over time it became one of the best decisions I ever made because it freed up money that I could redirect into something that actually grew. And that leads into the third rule, which is where the system starts to build momentum. Paul told me that $10,000 per year invested consistently is the minimum for a future that works. Not a perfect future, not a luxury lifestyle, but a stable one. And when I first heard that number it felt big, because it translates to around $800 a month, and most people immediately think they can't afford that. But Paul challenged that assumption directly, because he said the money usually already exists. It's just allocated to things that don't build anything. And when I looked at my own spending, I realized he was right, because I had expenses that felt small individually but added up to something significant over time. Subscriptions, convenience, upgrades, small lifestyle improvements that I never questioned because they felt normal. But when you add them together, they represent opportunity cost, and that cost is invisible unless you measure it. $10,000 a year invested over a long period of time doesn't just grow linearly, it compounds into something much larger, because the returns start generating their own returns, and over time the growth accelerates. What matters is consistency, not perfection, because the first $10,000 you invest is more important than the next $50,000. It's the difference between zero and something, and that difference is everything. Once you cross it, you are no longer relying only on your effort. You are starting to benefit from your past decisions, and that shift is what turns effort into leverage. But this is also where most people get distracted, because they focus on increasing income without controlling spending, and that creates a different problem, because as income rises, spending tends to rise with it, and if you don't pay attention, you end up in a situation where you are earning more than ever but still not building anything meaningful. And that's where the fourth rule comes in, which is the one that surprised me the most, because it flips how people think about retirement. Paul told me that if your monthly spending crosses $10,000, you have created a financial requirement that most people will never be able to sustain long term. And when I first heard that, it sounded exaggerated, but then he broke it down in a way that made it undeniable, because your spending determines how much you need to be financially independent, not your income. If you spend $10,000 a month, that's $120,000 a year, and to sustain that without working, you need a very large amount invested, because you can only safely withdraw a small percentage each year without running out of money. And when you reverse engineer that math, you realize that every increase in monthly spending adds a massive amount to your required savings. It's not a small change, it's a structural one. Every extra $1,000 per month in spending requires hundreds of thousands more in investments to support it. And the dangerous part is that people don't feel this happening, because it happens gradually. You upgrade one part of your life, then another, and each upgrade feels reasonable on its own, but together they create a lifestyle that is expensive to maintain and even harder to escape from. I saw this happen to people around me who were earning well but constantly felt stuck because their expenses had quietly locked them into a system that required continuous income. And that's when I understood that financial freedom is not just about earning. More, it's about controlling how much of your life requires money to sustain. Paul lived well below what he could afford, not because he had to, but because he understood that every dollar of spending is a commitment that extends into the future. And he didn't want a life that required constant maintenance. He wanted flexibility. And that brings us to the final rule, which is the one that ties everything together, because it prevents you from making mistakes before they happen. Paul told me, before you upgrade your lifestyle in any way, you need to prove that you can handle it first. And the way you do that is by saving $10,000 at the new level of spending before you commit to it. He called it the stress test, and it completely changed how I approach decisions. Because instead of asking, can I afford this right now, you ask, can I sustain this without breaking my system? For example, if you want to increase your monthly spending by $500, you don't just start spending it, you simulate it by saving that extra $500 every month until you reach $10,000. If you can do that consistently while still maintaining your investments and your buffer, then you've proven that the upgrade is sustainable. But if you struggle to do it, then you've just saved yourself from making a decision that would have added pressure to your life. I used this rule multiple times, and it stopped me from making decisions that felt affordable in the moment, but would have slowed me down long term. Because there is a difference between being able to pay for something and being able to carry it without stress. Most people confuse those two, and that confusion is what keeps them stuck. The 10,000 stress test forces you to separate emotion from reality. It shows you the true cost of your decisions before you make them, and over time it builds a system where your financial life becomes stable, predictable, and scalable. When you put all of this together, you realize that 10,000 is not just a number, it's a framework. It's a way to think about money that simplifies complexity into something actionable. 10,000 as your buffer protects you from falling. 10,000 as your car limit protects your future growth. 10,000 invested every year builds momentum. 10,000 as a spending awareness level keeps your lifestyle under control. And 10,000 as a stress test prevents bad decisions before they happen. It's simple because it's not easy, because it requires discipline and patience. But the people who follow simple systems consistently end up outperforming those who chase complicated strategies without structure. Paul didn't have a secret investment strategy or a lucky break. He had a system he followed without exception. And that's what gave him the ability to walk away from work while everyone else kept going. And the most important thing I learned from him is that financial freedom is not about doing extraordinary things, it's about doing ordinary things without breaking the rules that actually matter. And once you understand that, you stop looking for shortcuts and start building something that actually lasts.